Welcome to my very first GB News original, which I am doing with Rupert Shortt, who is a very distinguished academic, journalist, writer, philosopher. And we're going to be talking about religion, particularly persecution of Christians. And he is, I'm afraid, a bit of a guinea pig, as this is my first one. Rupert, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
I thought we might start with your wonderful book, The Eclipse of Christianity, which you wrote, which fascinated me because you're both very worried about Christianity, but also quite optimistic. I wonder if you could explain a bit about both your optimism and what you think has gone wrong.
Yes, you put your finger on it. The book pivots on a paradox. Christianity in the world as a whole is not in eclipse. Like Islam, it's growing pretty strongly. On the other hand, there is no doubt that in Christianity's heartlands in the Middle East and in Western Europe, which is my main focus, the eclipse is pretty clear, pretty far advanced. Of course, it is in the nature of eclipses to end, and so I'm not proclaiming the imminent death of Christianity, but the book does have the quality of a lament nonetheless.
And there are different things going on, aren't there, in Western Europe and in the Middle East? We might come on to the Middle East in a moment because there's active persecution of Christians there, which is making it very difficult. But in the Western part, in Western Europe, it's not so much a decline of persecution, it's a decline because of lack of interest, lack of education, and a degree of secularism that is trying to push Christianity out of the public square.
That's right. I mean, we're spoilt, we're individualist, there's been a decline of deference. Part of that is perhaps very welcome. I'm not too nostalgic about a period when the church ruled the roost too much and bossed people about. I am perhaps the only Rupert on the planet with a brother called Seamus. I have Irish antecedents. Unlike most British Catholics, I also grew up in a Catholic country, not Ireland as it happens, but Spain. I can see the problems associated with the church having too much influence and power, but also with it having too little. And I think Christianity at its best tells an extraordinarily rich story about human flourishing in all its dimensions. So my concern is that we may be throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Because you quote the line from the 1930s that there are only three people whose opinion mattered: the Prime Minister, the editor of the Times, which I quite like because my father was an editor of the Times, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. And would you say that at that point there was too much influence from the church, even though that's obviously an overstatement, but there was too much influence of an established church that essentially made Christianity in this country slightly sclerotic. It was very formulaic and established.
That's right, and you could argue that with the decline of deference, the church is leaner and healthier because people go because they want, not because they're pressured. But the decline in literacy about Christianity, and I think there may have been an assumption on the part of many that with the decline of the church we could have all that was good about Christianity free of all the metaphysical baggage. Now that may have been true about 50 years ago when there was enough of a residual Christianity in the culture. Spool on to the much more polarized 2020s, and I think that one might say that, you know, hashtag be kind, not that we are particularly kind anymore, but hashtag be kind is a pretty thin conceptual foundation. And maybe, as many people have observed, God and the good are conceptually complicit. We can't have, we can't just have the scaffolding without the building itself, and that a spiritual revival is in order.
And you quote Tom Holland's book, Dominion, which is, I think, a very important book in explaining that the ancient Roman had no conception of our approach to morality, that it is not automatically in human nature to be kind. Indeed, it's probably automatically in human nature to be cruel, and it's only the self-control and the self-understanding that Christianity brings, the value of all Christian souls, that makes people kind.
I think the irony of a lot of secularism is that it is much more indebted to Christianity than it realizes. This is the water that we swim in. You will have noticed that chapter 2 of my book channels Monty Python. What have the Roman Catholics and other Christians ever given us? Answer, more or less everything. Parliamentary democracy, individualism, the sovereignty of conscience, science itself. And although, of course, there were in the ancient world admirable philosophies, Stoicism, for example, is an admirable philosophy, it's nevertheless a very aristocratic vision of the world. Stoics didn't go around fishing people out of the gutter or founding orphanages. The Christian revolution, the universalizing, radicalizing of the vision of the Hebrew Bible was genuinely transformational, and it is no accident that as the faith spread like wildfire round the Mediterranean rim in the first few centuries, that it was women and slaves in particular who were most attracted to the faith.
Because it recognised that every soul was of equal value, and this is from the very earliest teaching of Christ himself, but also emphasised by St. Paul. So it's at the very beginning that this is clear, and anyone who thinks that Christianity was pro-slavery just needs to read Philemon.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And I mean, the teaching that all are made in the image of God is, of course, absolutely transformational. And incidentally, far from entrenching a narrow exclusivist Christianity, it's precisely because of that belief that I find in my encounter with members of other faiths that they can be God-bearing to me. The Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations, needs to be set side by side with the Great Commandment, you know, love your neighbour as yourself. And yes, of course there have been lamentable episodes in Christian history, but ultimately Christian teaching contains the antidote to its own poison, I would say.
And one of the things you point out in your book, which I think people easily forget, is that Christianity has faced challenges before, that in the 18th century church attendance in England was very poor. It picks up very strongly in the 19th century. And it's not always prosperity that makes people less religious, because they were getting more prosperous in the 19th century, but also more churches being built and the urban parishes thrived. This then seems to stop in post-war Britain. What are the factors that you think lead to the decline and lead to, particularly, which is an 18th century thing as well, a loss of faith amongst the leaders? Because I think the elite in England are much less religious, or at least less ostensibly religious, than the population at large.
Yes, that's a very important point. Elite beliefs, luxury beliefs, tend to be secular. It's striking, isn't it? You can have a small group of people in the Westminster bubble or leading the institutions of culture who have a rather top-down attitude to the world. They think of religion as something rather childish that has been outgrown, and of course that is not necessarily the view of the population in general. People have all sorts of beliefs. As to more general reasons for decline, I think common sense would suggest that people in the past went to church for reasons of social convention as well as an urge to worship. People were perhaps lonely, they wanted to meet their romantic partners. It has to be said that the arrival of the television played quite a large part in the decline of church-going during the 1960s. There are all these sociological reasons, but my fundamental point, as I've indicated, is that we may be losing something immensely precious by turning our back on the institution and the faith in toto.
And you get little things, which again you mentioned in your book, that stop people going, COVID being an obvious one. But I was fascinated to see you thought the 1962 winter stopped people going because they couldn't go for a few weeks. The habit breaks and things stop. So it's always very delicate, church attendance.
That's right. One of my elder interviewees told me about the winter of 62, 63, before I was born, where people were so terrified of leaving their own homes, even to walk, let alone to drive, that church-going declined fairly steeply, and some people said never picked up again by the latter part of that decade. So, yes, a delicate situation, but as you, as spending much of your life in London, will know, this city has become a much godlier place since the turn of the millennium, thanks to immigration.
For a variety of churches. And you get people who seem to want rigour. I noticed that the Brompton Oratory is full for its extraordinary form Mass, and I understand, I've never been, that Holy Trinity Brompton is full for its rather different style of Christian worship. That's what people want. They want the real deal. They don't want the polite Christianity. And I wonder whether an established church, because it's so entwined with the establishment, finds it very difficult to preach robustly, because that's a bit of a shock to the elite, and that the bits that are doing well are the bits that are really robust in their Christianity.
Yes, I am a lifelong Catholic, and I'm not sure I ever seriously thought about becoming an Anglican, but when I was young in the 80s and 90s, I respected what struck me as a grown-up form of Christianity that permitted principled disagreement between adults on, let's say, second-order issues. And there were times when I found my own church a bit authoritarian. Spool on a generation, and I think that the worry about Anglicanism is that it can be buffeted by the winds of secularism. Let me give you an example. There was an exchange on what's known as Anglican Twitter 2 or 3 years back, in which a renowned priest was asked to define the essence of Christianity, and she said it's all about inclusion and outreach and equality, and listed a series of goods which could be shared by all sorts of organisations. And another renowned woman priest replied to her saying, well, actually, I'm sorry, I'm not sure that is the heart of the gospel. At best, the goods that you have listed are consequences of believing the truth of the gospel, which is that God became man to redeem us. A lot of people do not want to turn up at church and get a sermon about Gaza or about climate change, very important though those subjects are. They want full-fat Christianity, and they want to hear the gospel being preached. And that is what you would get, certainly in the traditionalist Catholic Church that you mentioned, and in evangelical churches, and also among Pentecostals. Pentecostalism is now the second largest Christian family on earth. It's the Christian counterpart to Islamic revivalism. There are now well over 300 million Pentecostals, so the faith is spreading like wildfire, especially in the global south. But because Pentecostals are resolutely non-violent, the Western media tends to ignore them. There's this lazy narrative embedded in journalism that religion is A, dead in the West, and B, violent in the East. Whereas in fact, honeycombing around the edge of the global megacity, you find thousands upon thousands of communities, very often led by women, in which very poor people are getting their lives on track. Men are forsaking promiscuity and the bottle. And whatever you might think about the sophistication or otherwise of the theology, the social capital generated by Pentecostalism is extraordinary. And while researching my book, I went to Leighton in East London near the Olympic Stadium one Sunday morning. And one would be very innocent to imagine that the heart of spiritual life was in the parish church there. You had to go to the business park on the edge of the neighbourhood where you would find not one or two but three huge Pentecostal congregations.
And this is interesting, isn't it? Because the general narrative in the UK, and particularly England because of the Church of England, is that the Church of England is declining, therefore Christianity must be declining, and as there's no immediate prospect of the Church of England recovering, it's all over and we're a secular state, and the fact that the coronation remains a religious ceremony is about as much as you can expect, but that actually there is an unseen religious revival going on, and some quite interesting polling that although the census had Christian belief falling below 50% for the first time, when you ask people more questions about their belief, they seem to have an awful lot of beliefs that are quite Christian, including expecting an afterlife and so on and so forth.
Lots of self-identified humanists believe in the afterlife. What people tend to believe in practice is quite a patchwork. And it could be stuff that they've ingested with their mother's milk, things that they've read in fiction, picked up on the grapevine in various ways, which is part of what impels me to say Christianity, it's not just an immense force for good. I mean, I would say pretty objectively it is the largest single source of social capital on earth. But that would be rather an instrumental way of putting it. Ultimately, of course, I believe that it's true, and that its claims are a lot more intellectually robust than a lot of people realise, particularly opinion formers, as you have indicated, who are far too inclined to dismiss it as a fairy story.
Well, part of the reason I'm willing to accept as a package the teaching of Holy Mother Church is that over the last 2,000 years, the greatest thinkers who have lived have contributed to the magisterium of the Church. And who am I, so I'm not a Protestant, to stand up and say, well, I've read the Bible and I know better. And I think this is a huge power within Christianity, but particularly within Catholicism.
Well, and of course many Catholics in particular would agree strongly with that. My smudge on the wall of life is not a huge one, but I have tried to make a point out of, well, not preaching, but talking to the unconverted, as well as to people who are inside the religious loop. And I have written a little book called Outgrowing Dawkins, which is a rebuttal of Richard Dawkins' book Outgrowing God. Outgrowing Dawkins, God for Grown-ups. And somebody like Dawkins, who speaks for a great swathe of the intelligentsia in this country, takes it for granted that Christianity involves believing 6 impossible things before breakfast. But you would never guess from reading his work that, for example, most Nobel Prize winners, or no, I think it's a substantial majority of prize winners in the field of physics, have been believers in God. For some curious reason, in biology, the level is lower. But the old idea that there is this inherent conflict between science and religion just now seems terribly old hat. The late Chief Rabbi, Jonathan Sacks, put things so well, I think, when he said, "Science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean." Science, in other words, explains the relationship between phenomena. It explains how state of affairs A gave rise to state of affairs B, but it cannot account for reality as such. That's not a criticism of science. Science is very, very successful within its own province. But in terms of an overarching account of the great questions of life, whence, whither and why, where do we come from, where are we heading and why, then you have to go to philosophy and religion.
Absolutely, and the sort of simplistic arguments that evolution denies God or that the Big Bang denies God fall down immediately, because if you take the Big Bang, you get immediately the question of why.
Completely. There was a debate in Oxford in 2012 between Richard Dawkins and Rowan Williams. I am Rowan Williams's biographer, and I have great respect for him, but I think he was perhaps a little gentle on that occasion. Richard Dawkins's intellectual beard, as it were, is a theoretical physicist in America called Lawrence Krauss, who's written a book with the inappropriate title, A Universe from Nothing. And it's only, as it were, when you get to the small print late on in the book, that you realize he's saying a universe from nothing, if by nothing you mean a quantum vacuum. Now, excuse me, a quantum vacuum is not nothing. It is an entity within a structured cosmos. One professor of physics said to me once, a quantum vacuum is as much like nothing as a million neutron bombs. The question, the ultimate question, how come something rather than nothing, is, as I say, for philosophy and theology, and the argument from classical Christianity and other traditions is not that it takes one big domino to set off a lot of other dominoes. That's an oversimplification, and after all, a large domino is an element in our own context. It's more about an underlying cause that you, on a different plane, that you might relate, for example, to the relationship between an author and his or her characters. When you ask, where is Shakespeare in Hamlet? Where is Jane Austen in Pride and Prejudice? The answer is that they are completely invisible, of course, while yet inhabiting every single line of the narrative.
Which is a very interesting way of thinking about God being both present, immanent and transcendent.
Well, the other very important point to emphasize is that the doctrine of creation doesn't just refer to something believed to have happened a very long time ago. It refers to something believed to be happening now, because contingent reality, nothing can make itself. We are not our own cause. And that therefore the sustaining energy of God is bubbling away under the surface all the time. Science can, within its own context, can give a comprehensive account of every physical process, but the underlying source and cause of all, sustaining everything in being, does not compete with that scientific explanation. And it's why, to use one of my favourite analogies, we can, or the religious believer can believe that he or she is a chisel for the invisible hammer blows of God.
That's a fascinating image, very attractive image. And it's very powerful because you then contextualize the decline of Christianity in the West to a point where there is an underlying truth from which it will be able to rebuild, and that this is part of a cycle. Your eclipse reference, that an eclipse is temporary, it's not permanent. And fascinating things, as we're on eclipses and therefore astronomy, I had on GB News last night the NASA scientist who has done a study from Chinese papers to work out that the star that led the wise men to Christ is recorded in Chinese papers and was a near-Earth comet somewhere around the distance of the moon that would have appeared to hover over Bethlehem because it would have been travelling at the same speed as the Earth was travelling and therefore looked to be stationary. And it's absolutely fascinating how the more you know, the more divine revelation seems to be supported by science and by facts rather than undermined. So this, I think, gives us great hope for the West. But I wanted to come on, as I mentioned at the beginning, to the Middle East, because it's where Christianity started, and yet the persecution is terrible. The Christian communities have been destroyed in many places, massacres have taken place, and inevitably Christians don't want to go back because they face death and torture. Yet the Western world doesn't seem to care that occasionally we get news stories about it, but very little. Why do you think that is?
Yes, it's frightfully fashionable to be a persecuted something else. It is not fashionable to be a persecuted Christian. Many people, I think, would be astonished if I said that Christianity is by far the world's most persecuted faith. Not only the most persecuted, but probably more persecuted than all other faiths put together. One of my other books is called Christianophobia. About 15 years ago, I turned more to geopolitics for a while, and I visited some of the most benighted places on earth. And it was partly triggered by that suicide video of the ringleader of the 7/7 bombers in 2005, who said, we're doing this because Muslims are being killed. And I remember thinking at the time, well, let's leave aside the inconvenient truth that the greatest mass murderer of Muslims of modern times is Saddam Hussein, or at least the man who carries greatest responsibility for the mass deaths of Muslims is Saddam Hussein. Look on a broader time frame and across a larger belt of the world, and you will see that it is Christians who are suffering far, far more. And I wrote, my book came out in 2012, and I mentioned that during the previous generation or so, about 600,000 Christians, so a population about the size of Manchester, had left Egypt. These would be Coptic Christians for the most part. Or consider the fact that in a vast belt of the world, from Morocco to Pakistan, there is barely a country in which Christians can worship without harassment, and where conversion from Islam to Christianity would be extremely difficult. And when you bear in mind statistics like that, it can really reframe things, especially when you also consider that this is not by any means a problem confined to Muslim majority countries. Christians are very badly treated in India, where many of lower caste backgrounds have converted to Christianity precisely through the gospel message that all are equal. They're very liberated by their Christian faith, but they suffer for it. And of course, the communist world is still highly, highly problematic for Christians and other believers.
Indeed, the Chinese communists persecute Christians, and I thought one of the worst things actually of the Francis papacy was the sucking up to China that we got from the Catholic Church, which seemed to be a terrible mistake, and letting down of brave Catholics in China who had refused to go along with the state-sponsored church. And the recent stories in Nigeria of school children being kidnapped and a constant disruption of Christian activity in so many countries in the world.
It's curious, isn't it? Partly, I think, because of the Pope's intervention, Pope Leo's intervention, and indeed Donald Trump's, there has been much more attention paid to the religious background of the children kidnapped in northern Nigeria last month. But when hundreds of schoolgirls were also kidnapped just over 10 years ago, there was great reference in the media to the Chibok schoolgirls. Michelle Obama, you may recall, got involved. It was vanishingly rare to find people talking about the Chibok Christian schoolgirls. And part of the point is, if they had been Muslims, they wouldn't have been at school in the first place. They wouldn't have been allowed to be.
They wouldn't be allowed to be at school
for the most part.
As in Afghanistan, where the education of schoolgirls has stopped since.
That's right.
Yes.
So people have their distinctive lenses. I remember just before the Chibok kidnappings, there was a story that attracted a lot of attention in the media about a Sudanese woman who was forced to give birth in shackles. And she'd been imprisoned because she was regarded as an apostate from Islam, although she believed herself to have been a lifelong Christian, even though she had a Muslim father who had abandoned her. Now, the line that you got on the BBC was, should the British government be giving aid money to a country that treats women in this way? She wasn't treated abominably because of her gender at all. She was treated abominably because she was a Christian. And if she had been a man, the penalties under Sharia law would have been even more severe. It would have been the death penalty for an apostate.
And the BBC doesn't like to say this because it upsets their secular message and the secular message of the British elite.
And the fear of giving offence to Islam. I have no interest in stirring up conflict with Islam. I think if you were to say that the 20th century was more about clashes of political ideology, totalitarianism of various kinds, socialism versus free market economics, you could make a strong case for saying that with the reverse of secularism in the world as a whole, that a big part of our flourishing in the 21st century will depend on the capacity of Christians and Muslims to get on well together. As I mentioned earlier, they are the two most formidable worldviews in existence, and whatever the opinions of bien-pensant secularists, both are growing strongly. So I have no interest whatever in picking a fight with Islam, but it doesn't seem to me wrong in the least to say in a measured way, just to point out what is happening and to draw attention to certain double standards.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point, actually, to conclude, that religion, both Islam and Christianity, is growing. Faith in God is growing. In a funny way, it's always been true for Christianity that the martyr's blood is the seed of faith, and that therefore persecution sometimes leads to great strength. But I think your end story is this is a time of optimism for people of faith, for Christians, that Christianity is not becoming, as the worship of the Greek gods became, something of the past. It is still something very much of the future, even if our own country has a little bit of catching up to do.
Amen to that.
Rupert, thank you very much for joining me and being my guinea pig. I think you've gone round the wheel. Is it guinea? No, I can't. It's hamsters who go round the wheel. So no, you've been the guinea pig, not the hamsters who haven't had to go round the wheel. But thank you very much.
Thank you.